Let's go live.
You're live now, Chairman McIntosh.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to a briefing this afternoon with the Appropriations Committee of the House of Delegates and the Ways and Means Committee of the House of Delegates. Today, we are going to talk about the Accountability and Implementation Board overview. We also have with us today the Maryland Department of Education, and we're very happy to start off this session with these two committees together, who really are the two committees that brought forward the Kerwin Commissions into the blueprint and are going to be transforming, we believe, education, K through 12 education in the state of Maryland through the next many years. So it's exciting for us to be here together. I want to acknowledge two people. One, the Vice Chair of Ways and Means, Delegate Washington, and also the Subcommittee Chair and on Appropriations, Delegate Barnes, who were the two members of these two committees that brought this bill to the floor and passed it and did such a great job working with all of us. So with that, I'd like to take this moment to also welcome the new chair. I guess she probably doesn't feel so new right now, of the Ways and Means, to kind of do an introduction to this afternoon's briefing. But we are very happy to have as our partner across the hall when we look at education policy and education funding together. We are very happy to have Delegate Vanessa Atterbury as Chair of Ways and Means. So with that, Delegate Chair, you want to say a few words?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Chair McIntosh. And I want to thank you, and I want to thank my Vice Chair and Delegate Barnes for all the work that they did on this incredibly important issue for all of our children. In my 7 years on judiciary, I got dubbed Mama Bear because I fight so hard for the kids, and there's nothing more important and significant in a child's life than the opportunity for an excellent education for every child, regardless of where they live. So I'm excited to work on this issue with your members of your committee and the members of the magnificent Ways and Means Committee. We are in the third decade of the 21st century that all of you have been working on this issue and trying to bear the fruits of labor of the Commission's work and the blueprint. And now the state is ready to meet the future and development of an educational system to lead the nation and place Maryland and the students in Maryland in every single zip code alongside the rest of the world to provide them with a great education. The blueprint for Maryland's future makes transformative changes in the areas of early childhood education, establishing universal pre-K that is free or subsidized for working and middle-class families, to the profession of teaching, helping teachers become leaders and treating educators with respect due to other high-skilled professions, to high schools, helping to ensure all students are college or career ready and graduate with a leg up in higher education or their careers. And most importantly, to the education of underserved families, ensuring that schools serving students and families who have been marginalized are provided the resources that they need so those students can compete in a global market. Today, we will hear from the Blueprint's Accountability and Implementation Board, tasked with seeing the Commission and the legislature's vision to fruition, and the State Department of Education on the progress that has been made towards achieving these goals. The AIB and MSDE will each have 15 minutes, and then members will have the opportunity to ask questions. So with that, Madam Chair, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much. We're going to first hear from, and we're happy to have Ike Leggett, who's the chair of the Accountability and Implementation Board, former county executive from Montgomery County, and great friend. And we're going to have with him another great friend to the legislature, someone who has worked with us for decades. Am I correct? Rachel Heiss, who has just been named the new executive director of the Accountability and Implementation Board. So why don't we start with you, Mr. Leggett?
Thank you so very much. And thank you for your leadership over the years, and not only fighting for education, but so many other things that impact the lives of Marylanders. Let me also acknowledge and thank the members of the General Assembly for your leading role in providing what I think is transformative measures to improve significantly the educational output of our students. What you've done is truly a magnificent thing for our state, for our children, and really for the nation in a way, because I think we have the ability to help lead this nation in new educational reform. Let me also acknowledge, as you just stated, our executive director, Rachel Heiss, an outstanding member of the staff that you've worked with over the years. And for so many who know her, she is bringing tremendous leadership and support to us overall. What I will do today is just highlight just a couple of important areas. Yesterday, I forwarded a letter to the governor and to the president of the Senate and to the speaker, outlining some of the challenges that we face and asking for a couple of things that I think we need in order to ensure that we get off the ground in a way that I think you intended. First of all, the board was not constituted at the date and time that you originally anticipated. We really did not get the formation of this board until November. And so we're asking that some of the dates that we originally outlined for programs of response be moved back. We've conferred with a number of people, and we think the dates that we've suggested in the legislation, and we may talk about that briefly today, I think are consistent with what I think are realistic goals for us going forward. Secondly, because those dates are in fact somewhat moved back and we're late getting staff because of that, we need some budgetary flexibility. We will not encumber all of the resources that are now beginning to flow to us until probably the beginning or the end of this fiscal year. So we need a little bit of flexibility to carry some of that over to ensure that we have the continuity that we want. And also, I'm going to urge for full funding that you, I think, intended, or I think the mandates were intended, because I think there is some lack of funding for a number of the programs that are inconsistent with the overall goals and objectives that you've outlined. Those are the three areas. But let me state unequivocally that with your support, with the communications that we've had around the state and the willingness to work on these particular challenges, I am confident that we will have a great, great outcome. This is not a sprint, this is a marathon. And as a result of that, we have to be committed for the long haul. And what we're providing today is the foundation for a truly transformative education in the state of Maryland for all of our students. So, Madam Chair, thank you so very much for having us here. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to walk through in detail the couple of points that I've just described, the dates and the precise changes in legislative or particular flexibility that we need. Thank you.
Thank you. Rachel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Madam Chairs and members of the committees. It's very nice to be here. I'm truly honored to be in this new role and to continue the hard work that you've all been doing and that I've been doing to make the blueprint law. And I think now the even harder work is before us, which is to make it happen. And I'm glad to be part of that. I wanted to share my screen. Let's see if I can. Yes. Okay. Can you all see that? So There we go. Okay. So as the chair said, we just have a PowerPoint. It's pretty brief and I'll just kind of run through it. So here's the outline of the presentation, but essentially review the timelines that the chair talked about and the other activities that the AIB is focused on as it is establishing both the board and the agency, and then some discussion about the budget and also the unfunded blueprint programs in the budget, and then finally the next steps. So this slide here is showing the statutory timeline that was part of the Blueprint 2.0 legislation from last session, which was an update to the original timelines. But this is where we are in terms of what is in the law today. The AIB was to adopt the comprehensive implementation plan on February 15th, so earlier this week. That is sort of the 12-year plan to guide the implementation of the blueprint for Maryland's future and the benchmarks for outcomes. MSDE is to submit a criteria to the AIB in April that would be the criteria that MSDE will use to recommend whether the AIB should approve a school systems plan or not. And then the school systems and all the other entities that are responsible for implementing the blueprint, their plans are due to the AIB on June 15th. Clearly, given the delay, none of that is feasible. And so here we have, as the chair said, the AIB was fully constituted in November, and they held their first meeting on November 15th. I started the job formally last Monday. And then they're actually, it's just me and a legislative fellow that I'm very happy to have until April, when there are 4 additional positions that will become available when the budget passes, assuming that the legislature leaves them intact. And then in July, there will be an additional 10 positions available, and that would be the full complement of 15 permanent positions that were initially envisioned for the AIB. So here we have what the AIB is proposing as the new timeline, and essentially the timeframes in the statute are sort of being, we tried to stay true to those, but kind of superimpose them on, you know, the date where we're at in terms of being able to implement things. So the AIB would begin next month in developing the comprehensive implementation plan. And then over the course of the spring and summer, and you can see down here below are the activities that the AIB would be engaging in around the comprehensive implementation plan. So in the spring and summer, the AIB would be working on drafting the comprehensive implementation plan, as well as identifying key activities and milestones for the upcoming school year in each of the 5 blueprint, what we're calling pillars, or the 5 policy areas that were part of the blueprint for Maryland's future. And then over the LEAs, the other governmental units that are implementing portions of the blueprint, including MSDE, and also in partnership with MSDE, beginning to provide training and technical assistance to the school systems and the other entities. And of course, the development of the plan will be held in public sessions. And then what is being proposed is that this was not part of the original blueprint, but to actually have a draft plan that is adopted and put out for official public comment from the public and stakeholders before the AIB would adopt the final comprehensive implementation plan in December, on December 1st. Instead of having MSDE submit its criteria after the plan is finalized, we thought it would make more sense to have MSDE submit the criteria before the draft plan is adopted, so that those criteria can be essentially incorporated into the plan. And then finally, the proposal is that the school systems and the other entities that need to submit blueprint implementation plans would submit those by March 15th of 2023. And then the AIB would review those over the spring and early summer, so that the plans would be, hopefully all approved, and could begin to be implemented for the 23-24 school year.
Rachel, let's also emphasize that in working with the board and the local boards, an awful lot of work will be ongoing despite the new timeline, so that we will not lose a lot of time as a result of that. So we will not be sitting still. They may be implementing portions of that as we go forward.
Exactly. And then there are many, many other things that the AIB will also be doing over the next year, which includes, all the things that you need to do to start up a new agency, staffing, budget, and then also developing a website. We're working with the Department of Information Technology to get a website up and running as soon as possible. There also, the AIB has already discussed the intent to establish advisory committees that would provide additional input and feedback from community members and stakeholders from around the state. And we're going to be moving forward on those as soon as we have a website that we can use to post information and help to recruit applicants. And then there's also the many implementation partners that the AIB has in implementing the blueprint for Maryland's future that will be working with, establishing protocols and communications so that, there can be good consultation and collaboration. And then also the blueprint implementation coordinators that actually the House committees added to the blueprint law. These are each school system and county are required to appoint one person to be their blueprint coordinator to work with all the entities in the county. And so we're going to be working with those folks, providing training, both with the expert review teams and working with MSDE also on school leadership training, developing a public outreach program. We will be submitting our annual report in November. The AIB was not constituted in time to provide an annual report in 2021. And then also one of the big upcoming milestones is to contract with an outside entity to conduct a program evaluation so that we can see how the first few years of blueprint implementation are actually, whether it's working or not.
Good.
So then these next few slides are about the budget. So the fiscal 22 budget, which is the year that we're in, the AIB has now received $1.35 million, and this is from the supplementary appropriation that the General Assembly provided in the fantasy gaming and sports betting legislation last year. And so we are receiving quarterly revenues from that source. And at this point, that's enough funds for us to do what we need to do right now. And the real issue and concern is, as the chair mentioned, not being able to actually utilize if the full funding comes. And part of that is the timing of it. As you know, sports betting licenses were awarded towards the end of last year, and we're actually there actually hasn't been any revenue coming forward yet from the sports betting licenses themselves. To date, the revenues have been from the fantasy gaming regulation. And so once those sports betting revenues come through, likely later in the fiscal year, that's the concern, is that it won't be able to all be spent by the end of the fiscal year. And it is important to note that based on the Board of Revenue Estimates' latest projections, they think that there will be about 13 million in total fantasy and sports betting revenues in fiscal 22, which is just about enough to fund all of the programs that the law provides supplementary appropriation to. But all of these programs will be pretty much in the same boat as the AIB, in that they won't be able to spend the funds that come in towards the end of the fiscal year. And so, as the chair noted, the AIB is requesting the ability to carry forward those funds into fiscal 23 for the AIB and also the other blueprint programs that are shown here on this list. And then for fiscal 23, the governor did include the full $4.8 million funding requirement in the law, in the budget, and those funds are, in addition, the full 15 number of personnel that I mentioned. There are some programs that are not funded in the fiscal 23 budget, however. The biggest of those, as I know you're all aware, is that education effort adjustment, the funding for Baltimore City and Prince George's County in the first year to assist actually the county governments, the city and county governments, in affording the increased local funding requirements for under the blueprint. You can also see other programs that are not funded, some of which were also on the list for the supplementary appropriations for. So, for example, the expert review teams that MSD is actually recruiting for right now, and the Career and Technical Education Committee, they have not received any funding yet in fiscal 22, and now also are not funded for fiscal 23. So the AIB is just urging the Governor and General Assembly to provide full funding for all of the blueprint programs. And just this last slide, next steps are fairly, I think, self-explanatory. And with that, let me stop sharing my screen. That concludes our presentation.
Are there any questions, Madam Chair?
Yes, if you have a question.
Chairwoman, you're muted.
Well, we'll alternate between committees. Raise your hand and I will call on appropriations members, and Chair Atterbury will call on Ways and Means members. So we'll begin. I'll take the first person, and we'll ask Delegate Kettleman to ask her question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess the thing that I would most like to know, and I realize it's in the beginning and you've done a great job getting things set up. The two questions. The first is the implementation plan. I have wondered ever since I've been reading it, is the implementation plan, the way it's written, it says that it's your job to make sure the plan gets implemented as it's written up. But where is it and when is it that we could have a measure of exactly how much success we're having in terms of educating kids?
I think there's a point in here in terms of the funding to make sure that we have the study that you've already contemplated that we should have. And I'm not sure that it comes within the first or second year, but there's a requirement that you've already put in legislation that will periodically get an assessment of how well this is working. Rachel, you may have the precise time on that, but there's one that I think we have to respond to or get contracted and make sure that we get that review for you.
So a couple things that I would say. I mentioned the first official program evaluation would be completed in 2024, the fall of 2024. And that would be with an outside entity that the AIB will be contracting with to look at the outcomes that are being achieved by implementing the blueprint. But along the way, part of the purpose of the comprehensive implementation plan is to lay out both the activities and milestones that need to occur in each year around the different policy areas, but also the actual benchmarks for the actual outcomes that are anticipated or expected along the way. And so through the combination of implementing the plan and the AIB looking at those plans and the outcomes that are being achieved each year and providing you with that information, you know, at a minimum in the annual report, but I would imagine that there would be, you know, regular sharing of information. And then the program evaluations, the first one is in 2024, as I said, and I think the last one is in 2030 or 2031.
But all of that is contingent upon our receiving timely the resources that we've outlined and adjusting the dates accordingly so that we can have the resources, the personnel, and all of the things that we need in order to ensure that we respond appropriately to your concern, Delegate.
And just one last thing. When you say outcomes, I'm assuming that much as people hate it, you're looking at being able to test the children and see how we compare with other school systems and other school children. And yes,
I think assessment data will be part of that, but not the sole source of information.
Let me add something to that response, because one of the things that I've had conversation with people about is that there is an expectation that there will be a quick fix, that you provided the resources that we talked about. We have a new plan that we're going to implement. But in order to do this, you have to do it right, and you have to be focused on the outcomes. There are markers along the way to help to make sure that we're guided. But it would be wrong for us to say because we provided the resources, we automatically turn a switch and you get these significant results. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And we need to make sure that we do not oversell expectation, but we deliver on what you've expected. And I think we have the capacity to do that.
thank you.
Thank you. The Vice Chair Washington.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good to see everybody. Thank you to my fraternity brother, Ike Leggett, for taking on this new leadership role, and congratulations, Rachel, for your new position. Congratulations to you. The governor was speaking in front of the Black Caucus this morning, and he said that, to a question asked by our chair of our delegation, Nick Charles, asked about the funding levels for the Prince George's and Baltimore City. And the governor's response to that was that he's fully funded the Kerwin recommendations and funding formulas. Rachel, is that accurate?
Well, let me interject in there. Based on the intent of the General Assembly, we do not have the monies for those two categories for Baltimore and Prince George's County. And I believe that was the intent for 2023. And so we are asking for full funding of those requirements. So that's the way I would answer that, sir.
It was underfunded pretty much and not fully funded like we asked, like we intended in the legislation that we passed. A question, Rachel, for you and for the AIB. I wonder if you can speak to the racial equity component and how the board and how the AIB plans to make sure that the implementation is being equitably implemented. And also, can you speak to how you're tracking local school systems on closing the achievement gap as well? Those are two of the big pieces that we talked about during the Kerwin Commission meetings, as well as while we were talking on the floor about this too. So can you just speak to those for me, please?
Thank you. Let me interject in there, if you don't mind, Delegate. part of this goal is including the, reducing or eliminating the achievement gap. If we follow through on the very strong recommendations that you've made, we will close that achievement gap. That's my commitment. That's my belief. If we follow through, if it's properly funded, we hold all the people accountable for what they're to do, and we follow through on these measures, that achievement gap will close and the improvement of schools throughout the state will be there. As it relates to diversity, inclusion, I am very confident in the people that are on the board, that they are committed to inclusion. They represent a broad swath. There have been some question about that, but we're not the ones who selected the board. But we are committed and working with all local jurisdictions to make sure that we're going to achieve and even excel in that area. I would also indicate that we're in the process now of providing, and will provide fairly soon, the establishment of advisory committees that will be quite large, that would have some additional people on to make sure that the question that you've asked and others, that we will be able to respond to that much more appropriately.
I couldn't agree more with the chair, and I would just add that I think the comprehensive implementation plan is going to include exactly those indicators that you were talking about, Vice Chair Washington, in terms of looking at disaggregated data to see whether progress is being made in student outcomes, and whether the achievement gap is closing for different student populations, not just everybody, the average. You can hide a lot of information if you just look at averages.
Thank you. And that was kind of my point here about just making sure that that the board is looking at those implementation plans and making sure that we're closing the achievement gap. Not the diversity of the board, that's already said and done. That's not my concern anymore. It's about our students at this point and making sure that our students are achieving at a high level, which is the purpose of the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. So thanks, Rachel.
Absolutely.
Delegate Barnes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Shalay, great to see you. Rachel, I'll echo everyone else. Congratulations on your new position. I want to talk about a couple things. First, that 1.35 million, you said the legislature put in last year to get the AIB going. Why was it necessary for the legislature to put that money in? What was going on there? If you could just refresh our memory from last year.
Sure. Well, as I think everyone is aware, the governor vetoed the original blueprint legislation in 2020 during the pandemic, and well, still the pandemic, but hopefully it's getting better. And so as a result of that, because of the pandemic and the legislature, really nobody was able to gather at that point. The timing of the veto override occurred during the next session. And as a result of that, the governor was not required to put funding in the budget for the AIB. It was not mandated.
So again, he was hiding behind this. I wasn't mandated to do the money. So the legislature stepped in and did the 1.35 million. So we could get this vital AIB going. I mean, and that's much like his excuse here with, the education effort adjustment. I mean, it really just seems that unless he's mandated to provide education funding, he's not going to do it. And really, I hope I'm wrong. I hope he proves me wrong. I hope that he comes down with a supplemental budget that includes that money, the education effort adjustment for Prince George's and Baltimore City. I hope he does, because it's vital. And for us to start derailing the blueprint at this early stage for this vital funding for really these two counties that have the largest concentrations of poverty would be a shame. So I just kind of wanted you to confirm that we had to put that 1.35 in because he didn't fund it and he said he wasn't mandated, which is very similar to what he's saying. Isn't that right? With the education effort adjustment.
Thank you.
Isn't that so?
You took the words right out of my mouth.
Thank you.
Delegate Ebersol.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Mr. Chair and Rachel and the other Madam Chair. Pleased to be here. You, in that same slide area, we're talking about funds. The BRE estimates $13 million for fantasy and sports wagering. And then in the next slide, you showed how that might be used. Sports wagering will be ramped up. We have just a select group of brick and mortars right now, and that's going to expand. And then, of course, we're going to go to mobile platforms. Has the BRE given any sort of estimate of what kind of money will come once that starts, and how will that affect us here?
They have. I'm going to do this from memory, but I think that they're projecting about 22 million in fiscal 23. I can confirm that number, but yeah, it definitely is going to ramp up. And those revenues are dedicated to the Blueprint for Maryland's Future Fund. So those revenues will help to cover the cost of implementing the blueprint in the out years.
And they haven't gone any farther out than that, guessing people's behavior in gambling, which is a difficult thing to do, I know. Okay, so we just have we have a guess of 2023 right now, pretty good guess. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairs.
Thank you. Delegate Grice.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As we all know, I mean, the state of Maryland is very diverse. Whether it is there's a stark contrast, with the rural areas of the Eastern Shore, Southern Maryland, and then also the middle part of the state. And there's also a contrast really between Montgomery County and Baltimore City. And education is no different. And so when the IAB was established back in November, a big concern that we had on the shore is that we didn't have any representation, from the Eastern Shore, and that is critical. Counties like Kent County, where you have 300 square miles and you only have one high school, the way you approach education is going to be quite different there than it will be in the more urban parts of the state. So we do have a bill that will expand the implementation board by 4 members, guaranteeing regional geographic representation from other parts of the state. And I'm hoping, or my question for you all is, will the board support that? And then 2, I guess the other question, actually I just lost my train of thought what my other question was. Can you answer that question first? And then I may have a follow-up question.
Well, we're not going to take a position on that. That is something for the General Assembly to do. We have a board that I feel very confident about today, but depending on what you may decide to do is a decision based on the legislative intent and the priorities that you have to make a decision about the size and the composition of the board. But we will not take a position on that issue.
Okay, because I think the way the original legislation was drafted is that it did require geographic diversity, and the board does not have geographic diversity. Now, to a certain extent, I will take responsibility for that, because I didn't advocate for it to be prescriptive enough to guarantee certain regions of the state have that representation. So I'll take responsibility. That's something that we should have thought about when that legislation was drafted. And also, too, when the decision was made, we should have been actively recruiting in all these other parts of the state. We didn't do that. But here we are now. We can still fix this issue of geographic diversity and making sure that we have members from all over the state who will have a voice, because this is an important board, obviously. I mean, we're talking about implementation, we're talking about accountability. That's very critical. And I would hope that you guys would take a position, because it is important. I mean, for me, when I serve on different boards, I value differences of opinion. I value diversity. I value all those things. And I would hope that your board would do the same. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question. I don't see any other members on Ways and Means that have a question, so I'll pose one. I think this is for Ms. Heiss. So during last November's Spending and Affordability Committee briefing, DLS advised that the comptroller has encountered administrative challenges in allocating sales.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're having some feedback. Everyone, please make sure you're muted. Thank you. So DLS advised that the comptroller has encountered administrative challenges in allocating sales tax revenues to the Blueprint Fund, and this seems to not be a one-time issue. So my question, it's multiple questions. Is this something that the AIB is aware of? Does the AIB share concerns that this may make predicting and understanding the source of revenue for education difficult? And would the AIB be supportive of a change to make these calculations more predictable? I think I can speak for myself and my colleagues in the House and the Senate that we want to take advantage of this one-time surplus that we have and make the best of it for for the blueprint and supporting our students?
Well, thank you for your question, Delegate. But the source of the funds and how you decide to fund the blueprint, I think, is a decision for the wise leadership of the General Assembly. We're going to advocate for full funding for the programs that you've described, and whatever you believe is best in terms of where those funds come from and how they should be dispensed, I think is a decision best left up to the General Assembly. We're not going to describe to you how you should collect or raise the funds. We're going to simply indicate to you what we need and hold us accountable and the local jurisdictions accountable for how those funds are spent.
I appreciate that. I think my question is more of, is it helpful for you all if that's predictable, if the source of the funds is predictable?
Well, certainly, but more predictability and consistency, because we're talking about a fairly long period of time. That goes without saying. Well, I agree with that point, basically, yeah.
Thank you. And good to see you, Mr.
Thank you.
Leggett, by the way.
Your father.
I will tell him you said hello.
Delegate Solomon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Rachel, it's good to see you. Former County Executive Chair Leggett, thank you for continuing your service, and thanks for being here as well. I guess I had sort of more of a policy question, and maybe this is more for MSCE when they're with us, but just sort of curious. I know there's been a lot of conversation around, what we'll see as a drop off in practitioners. We know we're having trouble finding mental health practitioners. I think we're already seeing a great retirement or resignation in teachers. And so I'm just sort of curious if it's something the board is starting to monitor, and whether we think we're going to have the personnel in schools, or they're going to have to sort of revisit some of that conversation, given the circumstances we're dealing with COVID are so different than they were when we started working on the blueprint.
Delegate, if you were asking me what is my most challenge or most difficult concern here, it would be having the personnel, especially the teachers, not only the quality of the teachers we need, but also to quantity, because an awful lot of what we have in those 5 areas in many ways depend on our ability to have the personnel in place to achieve that. Even if we have the resources, if we're not able to turn that around, it will make our job very, very difficult. So that's a serious problem. We've had some individual and collective conversation with the State Board of Education and others, and we will be working aggressively to try to resolve both of those challenges that you've just described, because I think they are crucial to our ability to have the success that we're looking for. If we're not able to do that, it will make that job very, very difficult. And as you know, and you can see, due to the pandemic and due to some other factors, the curve is going the wrong direction in terms of teachers. So we need to enhance, pay them appropriately, treat them as though they are the real professionals that they are, and ensure that we have the quality and quantity of teachers and other administrators, health care professionals and others, in order to achieve the objectives that we've outlined in this legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think there's a lot of willing partners here who want to help make sure that gets done. So thank you.
Okay, and I think the last question goes to Delegate Novotny.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I really appreciate talking through this today. In the presentation that you all had, a lot of what we're talking about is how we fund these programs moving forward and taking responsibility. One of the aspects that we saw during the 2019 to today is actually a loss of students. We had almost 28,000 students leave the public school system. In my personal opinion, even talking to people as of about an hour ago, is they're not coming back. These parents are holding you all responsible, us all responsible, by leaving because they're not happy with the product they're getting. They're going to homeschools and private schools. So my question is, obviously this year the funding will be different, but in the out years, have you addressed the declining populations, either specifically in counties or in the state at writ large, and how that will affect the implementation of this plan?
Thank you for your question, but I'm not sure whether or not those numbers are accurate in terms of the long term. I think it's too soon or premature to make any final decisions about what may happen in the out term, whether or not those numbers will continue to go down or increase in some areas. And the way I've looked at it across the state when I've had an opportunity to do so in the past is that we've had changes in different locations. In other words, some parts of the state may, in fact, be growing with students depending on the growth, jobs, and what have you, and others may be holding steady. But in addition to just the raw numbers of students, this requirement calls for us to do other things as well. That is to have additional support. And so I don't see right now that there will be a major change, but if the numbers continue in a very significant way, there may be some reason to make some adjustments. But I don't think we're anywhere near that at this particular point, but we'll keep that factor in mind. And if there are adjustments to be made, I'm sure that the General Assembly in its wisdom and our response to any questions that may develop as a result of that, we'll come up with a predictable manner in which to make sure that what we are spending is intended for improving the overall system and that we are held accountable for it in the most reasonable manner possible. That's what I can only say to you, but I think right now it's premature to fully answer that question.
Okay, so just to be clear, so we can disagree on whether or not those almost 28,000 students are going to come back. Totally understand that. But to be clear, you have not planned for, say, next year, if you had that loss of, I think it's almost 3% of the student population, like you haven't looked at what that would do to your budgets if we actually fund per student back again next year. Is that what you're saying? You haven't looked at that yet?
And that will be a discussion that we'll have with the State Board of Education and the local community before we get to that. But that's not something that we're responsible to do at this point in time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And the final question will be from Delegate Wilkins, so then we can move on with our next presenter. Delegate Wilkins.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And it's wonderful to see my former county executive in this role. So thank you so much for your leadership. And Rachel, we always appreciate the wonderful work that you do. My question is a quick one. I was just wondering, with the proposed date changes and delays from the governor that has sort of had us having to shift, should we expect to have to do legislation around those changes, or is this something that you all are able to handle on your own? Well, and what do you recommend?
I think we need a response by the end of the session, and I'm sure that you could probably do it in several ways. But I'll leave that up to you, the General Assembly, to decide how they want to respond to that. But we do need to have some acknowledgement and a path forward on this matter. But the precise manner on how to do that is going to be determined by the General Assembly.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Mr. Leggett and Ms. Hayes, for being here today and answering all the questions. And we will now move on to our next presentation from our State Superintendent of Schools, Mr. Chowdhury. His Chief of Staff, I know, is joining us as well, and the Assistant Superintendent of Financial Planning, Operations, and Strategy. So, Mr. Superintendent, whenever you are ready, you can begin.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair McIntosh, Chair Atterbury. Thank you for having me. So I have a presentation today. There's more slides than I have time for, but I purposely gave you more slides so you can, think more about them, and also the public can look at them. So I will zoom by some slides and spend more time on some other things. So again, thank you for having me. It's an exciting time in Maryland. I'm honored and excited to be able to be here to do this work. There's no better place to be in our country than in Maryland right now to really build a model for what it takes to really build a world-class system for our kids, especially those we have historically failed to produce great outcomes for at scale. So today I'm going to hit on a few things. I'm going to talk about what MSDE has been up to because there's a lot of things in the blueprint that say MSDE shall and MSDE will, and I want you to know that I am on top of those things. And we are. I wanted to talk about what those things entail at this point in our planning stages for implementing the blueprint and our collaboration with the AIB and other stakeholders. And then I want to talk a little bit about what does the early work look like on the ground? So I want to highlight some of the work happening in our school systems across the blueprint policy areas. So folks get a strong sense of like our school systems are leading. Our school systems are running and gunning, trying to win every day for our kids. And so I want to highlight some great things going on as we continue to charge forward. So first off, I want to talk about some reports. So we had to do a few different reports and turn them in to the Assembly in the fall. They are all published in public right now. I highly encourage you, if you haven't already, to dig deep into these reports. One of them is on pre-K planning. So the blueprint envisions our state moving to universal pre-K to the greatest extent possible, ensuring that our low-income families are able to access high-quality free public school pre-K, and as well as being able to subsidize our middle-class families not to exceed 600% of the federal poverty level as it is envisioned. So this report talks about what it's going to take, to implement these things. Also, it points to models across the country who have done bits and pieces of aspects of the blueprint. So everything from how do we process applications more efficiently? How do we unify forms? What does the tiering process looks like in terms of family eligibility, as well as expanding our childcare providers? Because one of the big things in the blueprint is envisioning a mixed delivery system, right? A combination, a portfolio of great options, best fit options, as I like to say, of both public and private providers. And so one of the key things that we highly recommend in this report, and I'll talk briefly about it, is having regional systems of unified enrollment. That is not true right now in our state. Families need to navigate different forms, different timelines. The blueprint envisions a mixed delivery system, right? And in order to do that, there is growing work nationally. This is work I've done in my previous roles to unify enrollment, have a shared hub where families can actually go and look at their options and be able to apply easily with support, whether it be a private provider or a public provider around early pre-K, and also around what kinds of educational learning environments they want, whether it's a Montessori or outdoor or something different than those things. So there are some models across the state. We do have something, there are some models across the country that I would ask you to really study and look at. We do have something in Montgomery County that has an attempt at centralizing forms and access, but it's not only important to centralize the process in which way families access a high quality pre-K, but also the process to apply should be easy. Because when you have multiple options and you have a high choice environment, it tends to skew towards privilege and affluence, and those who lack lower levels of social capital often have a more difficult time to access those things. And so that should not be the case. So this is something I would ask you to think about. We also published a report on English language learners. This is a topic that is near and dear to me. I have personally chaired this work group. Being born and raised in Los Angeles, living in Texas, Dallas, and San Antonio, and working at the state level, it is not a mystery on how to educate English language learners well. And I was excited to see that there's a work group charged with recommending what our state needs to do legislatively, financially, structurally, policy-wise to get this right. So we have submitted the interim report, and we have talked about what it's going to take. We have a final report coming in December, and all the work group sessions are public. So I highly recommend that you look at them. One of the big things we recommend is really incentivizing and ensuring that we are scaling dual language immersion schools. It is settled science and research on ensuring that English language learners, and not just for English language learners, as well as for native English speakers speaking another language, is a powerful thing for our kids. And so there are many models to look for. The work group has explored those models, and I would ask us to think about that. The vast majority of our ELs are in the early grades. That number took a dip in the pandemic, but now we are back again at above 100,000 ELs, 70% of which who are Spanish speaking. So this is a big area to think about. And like I said, the work group is definitely ensuring that best in class practices is what ultimately happens in our state. Another report that we submitted recently is the Neighborhood Indicators of Poverty. This is looking at alternative ways, what I will say smarter and better ways to better get at the adequacy question, right? Education, about one of the things that I was most excited about the blueprint when I saw it from afar before I knew I was going to be superintendent is the commission tried to tackle the adequacy question, right? How much does it cost to provide an education to a child who is in Somerset, in Baltimore City versus Worcester or versus Howard County? It is different. It costs different. And so, and currently we rely on Title I and farms percentages, and we are beginning to look at direct certification, but we can go deeper, and there's work around this. So I was excited to see that there was a charge to look at this. And so we've done some initial work with the census that essentially takes 4 factors and creates a depth of poverty measure for all of our census blocks in the state of Maryland. So the way I want you to think about it is tier 1 census blocks and neighborhoods, or students who have those qualities tend to make that level of income, tend to own their home, tend to be in the traditional nuclear household and have higher education levels. Tier 5 is the opposite of that. And neighborhoods that are predominantly, or schools that predominantly serve tier 5, students are likely to have that quality and be around people with those qualities as well, which creates a concentrated poverty effect as well. And so this is something I'm excited about. This is work I'm personally passionate about, really worked hard to bring it to Texas and scale it there. This is the map of Maryland in terms of what it looks like. And when you run those 5 tiers that I showed you, I'm going to just show you some maps. Here's Howard County and here's Prince George's County in terms of the 5 tiers and the census blocks that make up for it in terms of the school boundaries and borders and where it serves. Here is Baltimore City and Montgomery County. As you can see, Baltimore City, more than 50% of its, well over 50% of its census blocks are in the tier 5 in terms of the depth of poverty. And the tier 5 levels is not only concentrated in our core areas, there are parts of the shore that also have neighborhoods and children living in tier 5 census blocks as well. So something to think about. What could it look like at a policy level? New Mexico, for example, took this methodology and identified the schools with the highest depth of poverty and essentially gave them additional dollars, right? Grants ranging from $20,000 to $400,000. And in order to make sure that they went to the right things, you have policy bounds on it. So that's what you're seeing on the right side. The funding must be used for. So this is one way this is applicable. Texas, we took it and we did 2 things with it. We redefined how comp ed, compensatory education funding, is given to school systems. For example, San Antonio ISD, my old stomping grounds, is very similar into Baltimore in terms of the tier 5 neighborhoods. Used to get 50 million on the farms and title, and now under the new methodology, it gets 80 million because of its depth of poverty. The state of Texas also uses it to pay teachers differently as well. It's something called the teacher incentive allotment that ranges from $3,000 to $32,000 on top of base pay. So rural school systems as well as high poverty school systems have the biggest edge in order to be able to pay teachers well. And none of this is wealth equalized in Texas. It just comes straight from the state. So just to give you examples of how this can be used, I'm going to zoom by the next set of slides because I really want to get to district examples. One of the key things is ensuring that our low performing schools have the greatest amount of resources possible. And one of those greatest assets is having a great teacher. And so the blueprint takes that charge to say national board certified teachers who come and teach at low performing schools, you will get an additional 7,000 on top of the 10,000 national board national board teachers will get as part of the blueprint if you come and teach at a low performing school. We worked really hard to ensure that there was a statewide definition of a low performing school. We should not have 24 definitions of a low performing school. So we created a floor and ceiling that identified the first subset of low performing school, and that's going to be published soon. So we have identified that cohort of schools, and each year we'll publish which schools are eligible for that. Currently, there are 208 spread out across our state, and you can see where they are in terms of both the state definition plus the local flexibility that we created. So the local flexibility really allowed all of our school systems to be able to partake in what I call a strategic staffing initiative to bring national board certified teachers at their school. Currently, what does it look like? We have about 1,700 national board certified teachers in the state active right now. Less than 5% of them are actually in the existing low performing schools, so 79 of them. So just to give you a sense of where we're starting from in terms of this initiative. There is interest growing for national boards. So you can see over the years, the blueprint is having an effect. So people are interested. Interest is one piece. You've got to complete the program. It takes 2 years. So that's very important. The department will work really hard to ensure all districts are supported in that. You want to annually run cohorts to be able to complete this. Let's talk about expert review teams. This is a team of experts who will be deployed to our schools to provide support and coaching and feedback. They will visit high performing schools and low performing schools. We are currently recruiting and building them. And we are happy that we've received over 200 applications, 100 of which are eligible to move on to the next round, meaning they have the track record in order to build them. This is something I want to run annually and have a deep bench for, right? We want to have expert review teams. It's built on an international concept of school inspections and having folks to be able to come and give feedback. And so we're looking forward to this initiative as well, which is right now we are building for. And then finally, the college and career readiness is a very big initiative that reimagines what our children should be able to know by 10th grade. And the goal is every child is college and career ready by 10th grade. And then they jump into a pathway, whether they want to pursue higher ed, pursuing more AP courses, pursuing an associate's degree, or they want to jump into a high demand field, going through an apprenticeship and then ultimately graduating high school and jumping into that industry. We have published a report. This was not statutorily required, that we want the public to be able to track how this work is going. So we've published the first round of the report that looks at the initial thinking around how this can be implemented and then what it looks like, also pointing to models both in our state as well as across the country on how to get this right. This is the interim standard. The interim standard states that this is statutorily required, that we identify the initial 10th graders who are CCR ready using this standard. And then after this, we are charged with doing studies to basically redefine the standard. So we are currently identifying the interim standard, which will shape the funding, but the studies that we're doing looks to broaden that definition. And I will tell you right now, both personally as a leader, as well as what the research says, we cannot limit it just to test scores. We have to look at other things as well. And I'm looking forward to these studies validating what other studies have shown across the country, such as GPA and other things. Here is the original timeline for which the CCR standard needs to be implemented by. We have recommended to the AIB to revise this timeline, and here this is actually the revised timeline. So the revised timeline essentially ensures that we have a longer runway for our school systems to be able to plan out the pathways appropriately. This requires a lot of work. It requires you to change up how you staff your high school. It requires you to rethink how time works, right? You want to create flexible high school schedules so kids can do apprenticeships as well as other things. So again, we're hopeful that this timeline will be accepted just because it just makes sense. Let's talk about Maryland Leads. It's a grant program I recently released using ESSER set aside. This is the money that was left over at the department to do what it thought was the right thing to do with it. I could have used it to build up the department. I decided to push it down, but not push it down to do whatever you want with. We identified 7 high leverage strategies that will help both anchor blueprint implementation or kickstart blueprint implementation, but also help us deal with the pandemic. Everything from grow your own staff to transforming neighborhoods to community schools to school day tutoring to reimagining the use of time and ensuring our reading instruction is really aligned to the best quality reading. So this is something I highly recommend that you urge all of your school systems to jump into doing. So let's talk about what is happening on the ground. So pre-K expansion has been happening as we speak. It both predates the blueprint and then continues to be accelerated. As you can see, MSDE has distributed multiple grants since 2018, 30 million to 17 districts and then community-based providers. And that has led to an expansion of the number of children being served. And one example of this is in Charles County. So Charles County has expanded seats both last year, and then by the time next year comes around, they will officially have every seat as being a full day pre-K option. And this is what the blueprint envisions. And so we're great to see our school systems shifting towards that. So that's what's happening in Charles County. Judy centers continue to expand, providing great two-generation wraparound services that are much needed. 69 across our 24 local school systems. There were 47 in 2017. Today, there are 69. The other piece to highlight is our infants and toddlers program at Calvert County. It is doing great work. You got to start early. It's great to see there are the Assembly also think about bills, how to strengthen this work. It has enabled Calvert to hire more certified special education teachers, as well as build a coach-it model to support families in being their first teacher for their kids. We're also excited that we got a grant from the U.S. Department of Ed to support this initiative and study its effectiveness. And we know it will do great things, especially when implemented well. The other piece is community schools. Community schools continue to expand. You can see on the right side how many students are being served by community schools right now. It's about doing it right as well. So I'm looking forward to publishing a playbook on what great community schools look like. We want to make sure that they are truly having that effect of doing smart and appropriate and effective wraparound service for our families, so our schools can focus on teaching and learning. And so we are excited about this, and the blueprint definitely doubles, triples, quadruples down on community schools. And so it is growing. An example of community schools, Baltimore County is doing a school mobile unit. This is the actual schematic of the mobile unit that will essentially partner with a set of schools and neighborhoods and serve families in the neighborhoods. How awesome is that? And so this is what I mean by launching initiatives on a very smart and implementation level. And so we're really excited that they're doing this and looking forward to seeing it in fruition. And then finally, teacher compensation. The blueprint envisions, we talked about, staffing needs. One thing, we're going to have to pay teachers. We have to pay teachers like rock stars, frankly. And so starting pay is increasing. There was initial legislation to incentivize districts to begin to lift their base pay over time, and then ultimately moving starting pay to $60,000, as well as ensuring increases across the rest of the job architecture or career ladder system that school systems have. Here's an example in Calvert County that was able to use the early teacher salary incentive grant to begin to move their salaries up, ultimately on the way to making step one at 60,000 while increasing the other steps as well. With that, I will stop at this slide. The State Department is going through a massive internal shift, culturally, structurally, and it will be built for the blueprint. It will do great things. I assure you that. And we are in the middle of strategic planning. And so I ask you to please push this out to your constituents so they can fill it out. I'm at 6,000. My goal is to get to 20,000 people at least. Normally people get around like 8,000 when they do this. I'd like to have the most ever. And so obviously we have more than 20,000 stakeholders, but if you can please push this out, it will help to really help get input in our state to shape the education department and our work. Thank you so much. I stand ready to take your questions.
Thank you very much. And if we could take down the shared screen just so I can see folks. There we go. See if anybody has any questions. And the vice chair is going to be calling on his committee, and I am looking for any Ways and Means folks that might have any questions. So I don't see any Ways and Means folks with any questions. So I do see, oh, well, there's Delegate Hartman, and then Vice Chair Chang, you can call on your folks, okay? So Delegate Hartman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With us setting salaries and everything into years in the future with the blueprint and seeing the inflation that we're seeing right now, how are we addressing, are those numbers all set to move with inflation? How are we addressing that so that we can attract the teachers? My concern is, we have built in a certain amount of time off for teachers for planning and so forth. And then there's talk of, the challenge of hiring teachers. So how are we addressing that?
Well, the blueprint does not state that the salary will be adjusted, based on inflation. The starting salary is set to move up to 60,000, and as well as the 10% increase. Now, the runway in which to do it, right? That's something to maybe think about. There is a timeline in which that it's set by which when this needs to happen, and it is on the horizon. If there could be a consideration that there's an adjustment to that, but frankly, any adjustment to those things, right, are going to have to be weighed against an industry that needs to be elevated very fast, especially in this post-COVID era. And so we already struggle with having a deep bench of teachers applying and ensuring that people want to be teachers. And so I think it's very important. And of course, it's also locally bargained. So and the statute has that defined as well. So we would go with whatever the statute says on that, but it's not set to, slow down automatically based on, how the law was designed.
Okay, thank you for the answer.
Eric, you want to call on your members?
Madam Chair, I think you have a member of the Ways and Means Committee there.
Alternate to be fair.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Superintendent, thank you so much for the presentation this afternoon. Just shows the breadth of all that you all are doing, and it's great to hear that the blueprint is off and running to a great start. We look forward to all that's going to be done next year, and we hope that all the jurisdictions all across the state are able to do what they can with and have the resource that they can with implementing the blueprint. So thank you so much, Mr. Chaudhry. We'll recognize Delegate Novotny from member of the Appropriations Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I will echo the fact that I really did appreciate the presentation that you gave us. There was one thing that if you could go into maybe the next level of detail, you had mentioned addressing GPA and test scores as a means of viewing either the student or the school and how we might address that change. What does that actually look like to you, or what's the next level of detail?
It's college readiness, right? So the blueprint states that a student has to be deemed college ready in order to jump into a pathway. Right now, the statute says use test scores. So you use that level of test scores, the students deemed college ready, and now they can go into the CCR pathway, whatever that is, right? AP, dual credit, apprenticeship career. The country is moving towards, and there's decades of research that you should not limit it to just test scores. You should look at things like GPA as well as other things. GPA is actually a stronger predictor than test scores for college completion. And we need to wake up to that. And that's something that's what I'm referring to. So what I'm looking forward to is the rigorous studies we're doing. We're doing 2 studies, one with Mark at UMD, and I'm releasing an RFP to do another study. And I predict it's going to show what I'm saying around on the predictor of GPA. Frankly, the rest, a good chunk of the country has moved in. I'm from California. The UC system has moved there. Many people in the COVID era and test optional. It's opening more access. There's something about GPA. It has this, what do I say? You got to hustle to do well, to have a strong GPA, and that hustle factor is a tangible piece that's missing that test scores don't capture. So that's what I mean by that.
I thoroughly appreciate the knowledge that you're sharing with our committee here, and I think that's a great way to move forward. I agree that hustle is a big part of GPA, and thank you for your answer. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair.
And I'm glad that you also said hustle too, because I was looking for a more appropriate word.
Spot on.
Delegate Lasanti.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for the presentation. I was very pleased to hear that you have taken the initiative to develop a career readiness program report. And I think that my colleagues in Ways and Means as well as Appropriations would be very interested in reading that. But I'm very curious as to what you really were trying to accomplish in this plan, or so maybe you could elaborate a bit more about that and also give us a copy of the report.
Yes, so let's definitely make sure, Ari, they get a copy of the report soon. And then ultimately, the vision is students finish 10th grade and they're essentially, think of it like a major, right? They want to go to college so they can begin to take more AP courses, right? Because dual credit is a great way to reduce debt, as well as get kids to begin to, start knocking out courses earlier. Perhaps they want to pull off an associate's degree, right? So they can be in a middle college or early college model for that. But there are students who want to jump into a high demand field. That piece of the CCR standard still needs to be fleshed out. Some of our school systems are doing some great things around apprenticeships, for example, paid apprenticeships, but you really have to reimagine high school. You really have to create space in their 11th and 12th grade years for them able to, one, meet the graduation requirements, and then also jump into an apprenticeship and have a deep bench of employers who are willing to offer up and participate in them. And so that's the one that is the one that keeps me up at night. In terms of doing college readiness, right, and students jumping into whether community college or a four-year institution, we have decades of research on how to do that well. We have not been doing CTE well, right? And so I'm looking forward to the CTE committee. I'm looking forward as a department to make things more flexible, right? Do we have to offer a year-long course when we could offer a semester-long course, right? There's a lot of things that we can do. Montgomery County, for example, has a high school called Transcend Academy for high school for working students. These are students who have aspirations to go to college or jump into industry, but want to work out of necessity or just out of interest. And the schedule is so flexible that allows them to meet graduation requirements, either go off to college or jump into nursing or other things that they may want to do. So that's what we're envisioning. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And thank you for prioritizing that, because I really do believe that a good job is the most efficient path out of poverty. And
Absolutely.
so I appreciate the fact that you are highlighting that and putting energy into that sector. Thanks.
From the Appropriations Committee, Delegate Solomon's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Superintendent, it's good to see you again. Thanks for being here, and thanks to your whole team. I know you've got a lot on your plate right now. Just one quick question and one sort of a little longer that I'd love to get your thoughts on. Just curious if you all have it, I know a lot of this money is still being spent, but would be wonderful to see sort of like a full breakdown of what all of our districts are using their ESSER funds on, where the money's gone, where sort of the early blueprint funds have gone. I know one of our concerns that we got before you were here, but last year, was that some of the districts weren't following exactly what was supposed to be done. Obviously, without the AIB being stood up, that was I think we've alleviated some of that. It would be great to just see sort of a detailed breakdown that I think we could also use to promote the great work that's being done, just like you shared with us here. And then sort of bigger picture, you and I have talked about this before, but in the context of higher ed and connecting what we're doing in this great work in the blueprint, the drum that I beat all the time is, we should be so lucky if implemented with fidelity that we've got, thousands of now college ready first generation students going on to our university system, staying in Maryland for higher ed. And I think we'd love to see MHEC sort of play that role, but I don't think they've really done a good job of it. And just be curious your thoughts on how MSDE can better sort of align with the higher ed system, with K-12, and make sure that we've got financial aid systems that are working appropriately, and how we get those students to then stay and get in the pipeline in Maryland higher ed.
Absolutely. So one, we got to hang out with one another. So I'm going to bring back the P20 Council and want to reform that, right, and make sure, because MSDE traditionally was lead on that, and I understand that it kind of fell apart, so that's not good. I have begun engaging our college presidents individually. So, wanted to, because I want to get their thoughts on where they're at. The blueprint does have a line that ultimately sets that whatever the college and career readiness standard is, they must also comply with that. But frankly, I want to make sure they're bought in as well. It's great to see that some of them have already jumped into looking at GPA as well, like Montgomery College, for example, as well as colleges in the shore. So I think there's a there, right? And so I think got to make sure, we're hanging out together. And frankly, if I'm not being loud about it and setting the space, it's not going to happen. So I will put that on me and my team. So that's going to be very important. So that's my initial piece, but I have begun engaging every one of them individually, and just to see where they're at. And I think, we will be compelled to work together and make sure we get this right. I am not going to be shy about, hey, where are you at? Let's get this done. And so we're not going to miss this. We're not going to miss this mark. I had a great meeting with the new president of College Park recently. I'm really excited. He's from Oakland, California. I forgave him for that as a Los Angelino, but we had a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to continue to collaborate with all of them. So,
Thanks, Mr. Superintendent. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Delegate April Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. Mr. Superintendent, I really appreciate your comments. I do want to ask you a few things about the college and career readiness and CTE. And if I missed it, I apologize. I was trying to take notes, but so have you been briefed on what is your opinion on the PTEC programs and how is that going to factor into this plan as we move forward, if at all?
PTECs are good, but PTECs are only a step into doing apprenticeships. Really, we should be shifting toward the apprenticeship model. And so, the commission looked at and studied long and hard, the Swiss model, for example, they call it the VET model. And I think that's the model to push towards. PTECs are great. It's a version of the early college, middle college model. But the piece that it's missing is it doesn't go deep enough into the work-based experience, like actually working, getting paid for working, and then ultimately having the ability to jump into that field and have guaranteed hiring, right? PTEC is more exposure, right? And it's not necessarily guaranteed that you'd get picked up by the employer. Exposure is good. Exposure is a step along the way, but we really need to push for more apprenticeship models in our state.
I appreciate that. And I've followed PTEC for a while. I'd love to maybe talk with you offline because actually I recall in our committee, executives from IBM and other partners, it was part of having paid internships, and that a lot of times that these the kids that were involved in it as they went through got their AA and their paid apprenticeships were going on to being hired. So I hope that we can keep that as part, because I do think that PTEC does sort of follow some of those things.
Yes, absolutely.
In addition, where are we? So with the CTE committee, how can we as legislators who are interested in this be informed when they're meeting, help with hopefully providing input, and in particular, well, go ahead for that. And then I have one more follow-up if that's okay, Madam Chair.
Yeah. They haven't come together yet, and so just AIBs just came together, and so that there have been appointees. I don't actually form it; I'm a member of it, and then the governor appoints a few folks on there as well. Especially, it's a subcommittee of the governor's workforce commission board, and so there has been some initial names, but in terms of and then ultimately the workforce commission board will staff it, and then just like my English language learner work group that I do chair and staff, there will be live meetings and notes and everything else. Right now, the step that it's at is members have been named. And so we're happy to get that information and send it to you and where we're at with that. But it wasn't I wasn't the one who selected that. I'm one member of a few members. Yeah.
Okay, and just one final follow-up, Madam Chair, if it's okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm very interested in getting updates on the communication with some of our higher education schools. And I know you just spoke about that, especially University of Maryland. I think one thing that I'm hoping that you will keep to the top of your list is computer science, computer programming, graduation requirements, and really making sure that our higher education, especially University of Maryland, many of our schools accept alternate graduation requirements for computer science and computer programming. And that's been some pushback for our graduation requirements. And I think that with our kids having limited time to make choices in high school for graduation, there is so much opportunity, especially in Maryland with our proximity to high-paying tech jobs. I'm just wanted to put that push in there to make sure that everybody is aligned so that we can really give our kids that opportunity to get that education, if not just in a career and tech program, but even throughout our schools. So I really appreciate everything that you presented, and I just hope that, happy to chat with you offline, but I hope that we can make sure that we're all kind of working off the same page.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
From the Appropriations Committee, Delegate Mangione recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Superintendent. I just have a quick question, a little bit of a different direction, but obviously since this is such a largely funded program with the blueprint dealing with education, I just want to see if you can touch on one of the concerns I receive most is about the learning environment. And if there is anything in addressing the learning environment at all with misbehavioral issues, et cetera, in the implementation and your thoughts on how going forward that will play a role in such a big ordeal here with this program.
Well, the blueprint envisions elevating the teaching force and having amazing teachers, right? National board is a pathway towards that. And if you look at that experience of what it takes to become a national board certified teachers, right? It also requires you to not only be an amazing instructional pedagogical master, frankly, but it also asks you to be able to facilitate a really safe, environment that promotes critical thinking and productive dialogue. And so that's where that will ultimately live. So, and in order to move up the career ladder, and in order to be able to the move up to that elevated salary schedule, right? That's how the blueprint was built for our teachers to be able to aspire towards that. So those principles of ensuring a quality learning environment is embedded in that career ladder. Otherwise, you don't make it through the career ladder, or if you're not doing well, it's not the right thing for you, right? So yeah.
And thank you for that. And that's a great answer. And I appreciate that. And I guess offline, I don't want to take it in a totally different direction. Sometime we can discuss, because I know in Baltimore County recently some horrific stories. And again, I don't want to take it too out of this realm of some school violence, et cetera, but especially for the youth, just making sure it's a fostering environment is obviously critical, especially if it's such a large investment. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
From the Appropriations Committee, Delegate Valentina Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Superintendent. So what we've heard today is certainly exciting and invigorating, especially if we're able to achieve the outcomes. One of the concerns that I have is that as we talk about not only our capital commitment to building newer and more modern schools, and our commitment in the blueprint to the educators and the outcomes, is that if we don't put the same amount of energy in each school to assuring the health of the student, that it will really not matter how great the building is and how good the educators are. And so I know in the community based initiatives that there are some involvement of the idea that there'll be some wraparound services for healthcare, but I remain concerned that each school doesn't have a dedicated requirement to having a school nurse in the building to manage what really are complex and challenging needs for students who are there for long hours of the day with hearing tests, vision tests, mental health needs, medication administration. that really we need to go back. Our state used to require a nurse in every school, and then it changed the requirements, that we really need that if we're going to optimize the outcomes that we're trying to achieve.
So there's a few things in the blueprint. So there's community schools, but remember, not every school is a community school. I've said this to another committee. I'm forgetting the name, but I did recently. Yes, I said it to Senator Pinsky's committee, and Senator Hester asked me this question, and I said, we need to move towards a system that systematically screens every child in every grade annually for mental health and social emotional needs. I mean, that's where we need to shift towards, not wait for a problem, but be part, just like we screen for reading through the Ready to Read Act to see if there's reading deficiencies. We should be able to screen our students through a comprehensive approach to see if there is something wrong or something needed, both either materially, right, like hunger, or physically, or social emotional learning. This month, the board is doing a mental health deep dive with me and looking at that as we come out and in and through the pandemic. And so I am with you on that. There's a commission that the blueprint asks to essentially look at coordinated supports. And I would imagine that there would have to be supplemental shifts legislatively in policy that gets us there ultimately. So I'm with you on that.
Thank you. I just, in closing, continue to remain concerned that we do require at least the initial evaluations for hearing and screening, and we don't have a dedicated healthcare professional to even follow up on the findings of the test, just a letter back home to parents and no follow-up, and that we really do need to harken back to the days when we have a dedicated nurse in each school. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Madam Chair, that is all the questions we have on the appropriation side. On behalf of Chairwoman McIntosh, it's been very informative to join Ways and Means to be able to hear from an update on the blueprint. And just a reminder to the Appropriations Committee, we have a virtual bill hearing at 3 p.m. Madam Chair.
Very much. And thank you, Mr. State Superintendent, and to everyone else who presented today, and to your team. This was very informative. Thank you to both committees and for staying put for an hour and a half and being engaged with your questions. Reminder to the Ways and Means Committee, we will resume bill hearings at 3 p.m. Thank you, everyone.